Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP US History. Today we talk about our 11th president, James K. Polk. Now, the great issue of the election of 1844 was manifest destiny, the idea that God had obviously ordained that the American people spread from sea to shining sea, starting by annexing Texas, or Oregon, or both. Now, the Whigs opposed annexation of anything for several reasons. Of course, the possibility of war was very real if either Texas or Oregon was annexed. And the money spent subduing and settling the new territories would be money that would be better spent on Henry Clay's American system of internal improvements. Or perhaps that money could simply be returned to the states. Plus, new Western territories would further spread out and dilute the American population, which Henry Clay's followers wanted to unite into one nation. It would be hard to implement that American system with a very dispersed population. Besides, the West would probably fill up with the kind of people, those kind of small farmers, more likely to vote for the party of Jackson. Finally, any expansion into new territories threatened to undermine the Missouri Compromise by reopening the question of the expansion of slavery. Northerners in particular would be offended by annexing Texas, most of which is below the line of 3630, the southern boundary of Missouri. Southerners in turn would be concerned by the acquisition of Oregon. The Whigs, for the third and last time, nominated Henry Clay. Now, the Democrats actually wanted to keep annexation out of the election too, as most national politicians saw it for the divisive issue that it was. The Democratic leadership honestly hoped to nominate Martin Van Buren again. Although his one term as president had not been real successful, he did still have a lot of influence within the Democratic Party. But this was problematic, as by now Martin Van Buren had become a free soil man, which meant he wanted all new territory, all new states to be free. Slavery existed where it existed, of course. The Constitution protects private property, but slavery should expand no further. And this was seen as insulting to the South. And once this privately held view became publicly known, that undermined Van Buren. Still, he had a lot of support, but not enough. On each ballot, more and more support went to his various competitors, one of whom was Lewis Cass, a general in the War of 1812, a former governor of Michigan, and one who was open to expansion even at the cost of war. Another was James Buchanan of Pennsylvania, a pro-Southern politician. Although from the North, he wanted to keep North and South together and favored policies to keep the South happy. And he was a career politician. John C. Calhoun from South Carolina was strongly pro-Southern too, and although an enemy of Jackson, still a strong Democrat. But most of these did want to avoid Western expansion, Cass being perhaps the exception. And while no one had expected him at first, as the convention continued, support grew for James K. Polk, a former governor of Tennessee, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and a friend and pretty close neighbor of Andrew Jackson. And ultimately, Polk was chosen, because although he was well known in Tennessee, like William Henry Harrison 4 years earlier, he had taken few really strong stands and had few enemies on the national level. He had been a leader in the Bank War, so he certainly had political disagreements. Again, he was not a national figure, was not disliked by the American people. Because he was relatively unknown, something of a surprise nomination, he was described as a dark horse candidate, a term that still exists. And he also had the support of Andrew Jackson, who, although old, is still alive and influential in the Democratic Party. Indeed, Polk was depicted as young Hickory, borrowing the nickname of Andrew Jackson, to whom he was presented as a natural successor. On the other hand, Whigs made fun of this dark horse, saying, "Who is James Polk?" Polk ran an openly expansionist campaign. The Democratic leadership might not have wanted that, but the people, perhaps, did. He called for the re-annexation of Texas, the reoccupation of Oregon. The Whigs, on the other hand, said the choices were Polk, slavery, and Texas, or Clay, liberty and union. And Polk won the election of 1844, 170 electoral votes to 105, becoming the youngest man elected president to that point at the age of 49. But while the Electoral College was clearly in Polk's favor, the popular vote was very, very close. Polk lost his home state of Tennessee, a swing state, losing by 123 votes. Because while Andrew Jackson may have been a Tennessean, he was a Middle Tennessean, and not particularly popular amongst the people of East Tennessee. And some Tennesseans voted Whig for other reasons, too. On the other hand, Henry Clay lost New York in a fairly close vote, largely because about 16,000 voters chose to vote for the strongly anti-slavery Liberty Party, splitting the anti-Texas vote, and really hurting their own cause. Had even half of them voted, or less, maybe 5,000, voted for Clay, he would have won New York, the most populous state by this point, and the election as a whole. The president about to leave office is John Tyler, a man who himself had wanted an excuse to annex Texas, and he announced that Polk's victory was a mandate from the people to annex Texas, and convinced Congress to annex Texas not through a treaty, but through a joint resolution in the very last days of his presidency in 1845. He retired to Virginia, where in 1861 he would be initially opposed to the South seceding from the Union, but eventually voted to do so and had his plantation burned in revenge by the U.S. Army. Now, Polk was a short, thin man, although in person pretty reserved and quiet. As a stump speaker, he was a great orator, known as the Napoleon of the stump, as politicians then on the frontier often did give their speeches on top of a tree stump. He was a serious man. He took his job seriously, worked himself effectively to death. 14-hour days, assisted very much by his wife, Sarah Polk, the two having no children and devoting their lives to politics. During his campaign and his presidency, he created and pursued a 4-point plan, promising to retire and not seek re-election if he accomplished it all. He said, "There are 4 great measures which are to be the measures of my administration. 1, a reduction of the tariff. Another, the Independent Treasury. A third, the settlement of the Oregon boundary question. And lastly, the acquisition of California." And Polk got it all, or at least pretty close. He did indeed get a revenue tariff. His Secretary of the Treasury, Robert J. Walker, managed to get Congress to lower the tariff from 32 to 25%. New Englanders and New York and Pennsylvania opposed this but could not stop it. And actually saw that it was successful, at least for the time. There was a boom in the economy of the United States in the mid to late 1840s. So a lower tariff still managed to bring in plenty of money. And Americans continued to buy American as our economy grew stronger. Polk built an independent treasury, reviving Van Buren's old plan for treasuries and sub-treasuries to store the government specie, but with no affiliation or direct influence on the private banking system or the country's economy. In Oregon, Polk may have said 54-40 or fight when running for election, but with the election over, he fudged this one a bit. We already had all of Texas to digest and growing tension with Mexico. So, although some Northerners asked why the South got all of Texas, while the North only got part of Oregon. To avoid a war with Britain, Polk negotiated an extension of the existing border at the 49th parallel, over 5 degrees short of what some wanted, but for most people a fairly satisfying boundary. As the British did abandon a number of forts between the 49th parallel and the Columbia River. And the British, too, were happy to avoid a war. For one thing, the Hudson's Bay Company had already trapped out a lot of the region's furs anyway. And California, like Texas, had seen an influx of American immigrants, although probably about 1,000 or so by far, compared to about 13,000 Mexicans in the area and numerous Indians. And many of those Americans did want to be part of America, and of course Polk wanted to help them. And while the Oregon dispute had been settled without a war, the annexation of Texas and a desire for California would not be. As I've already mentioned, in the last days of his presidency, John Tyler convinced Congress to accept the Republic of Texas as a state in a joint resolution. February 26, 1845, Texas would officially become the 28th state in December of that year. So during Polk's presidency, but thanks to John Tyler. Now, in the months between Polk's inauguration and the official admission of Texas to the Union, James K. Polk sent John Slidell to Mexico to try to convince Mexico to accept the annexation of Texas and to negotiate the purchase of California and the land in between. Slidell was authorized to offer up to $25 million for this. But the Mexican government said it was insulting to try to buy this land at any price and would not allow Slidell to even present his offer formally. So, with it clear that negotiation was impossible, Polk decided to press the issue, specifically in Texas. Of course, Mexico did not recognize the Treaties of Valasco, granting Texan independence, and they certainly did not recognize Texan statehood in the United States. But to the extent that it recognized a border at all, it looked to the old border of the province of Texas, the Rio Nueces. And so that said that if there was a border, which there's not, but if there was, it would be at the Rio Nueces. The Republic of Texas and now the United States said no, Texas was clearly separate from Mexico and furthermore separated by the Rio Grande. So, in January of 1846, Polk ordered General Zachary Taylor, nicknamed Old Rough and Ready, to lead American forces into the disputed territory between the Rio Grande and the Rio Nueces, hoping to provoke an incident. And in this he was successful. Mexico demanded Taylor withdraw, but Old Rough and Ready refused. At last, on April 25th, 1846, 2,000 Mexican soldiers attacked an American patrol of 70 men, led by Captain Thornton. 16 Americans were killed. 2 much larger battles took place the next month, both of which were American victories, thanks in large part to the superior artillery of American forces and to better American leadership. Throughout the war, in fact, while American soldiers would describe the Mexican soldiers as very brave, and the Mexican people as a whole as very nice and likable folks, they tend to describe their leaders as idiots. And there's much to bear that out. Following the Thornton affair, President Polk declared that American blood had been shed on American soil. And on May 13th, 1846, Congress declared war, although a few Whigs, including John Quincy Adams, voted against the declaration of war. And later, in 1847, an anti-war Whig congressman from Illinois, named Abraham Lincoln, introduced what was known as the Spot Resolution, demanding to see the spot of American soil where American blood had been shed. A resolution that was not particularly popular back home, and Lincoln was not reelected to Congress, although, to be fair, he had pledged to serve only one term, many Whigs claiming to believe that people should rotate in office fairly frequently, Henry Clay, I'm sure, being an exception. The Mexican Congress declared war in return, July 7, 1846. And from exile in Cuba, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna offered to return to Mexico. Said if Mexico would take him back, he would lead the army against the U.S. forces, and promised that he did not want to be president of Mexico again. If he can come back, he'll lead the army to defend his country. He also contacted the United States and said that if we would help him get to Mexico, he would lead an uprising, take over the country, and sell all the disputed land to the United States. Mexico invited him back. The U.S. Navy allowed him to go. Once in command of the Mexican army, he declared himself president of Mexico and moved north to fight Taylor, who had recently crossed the Rio Grande and begun marching towards the city of Monterrey. At Monterrey, the new commander of the Mexican army in the area, Pedro de Ampudia, had decided to stand and fight with over 10,000 men to defend the heavily fortified city against Taylor's 6,000 men. And the battle to come would last from September 21st to 24th, 1846. And among the defenders of Monterrey were a unit known as the San Patricios Battalion, the St. Patrick's Battalion, made up of Americans, mostly Irish Catholics, who had deserted from the U.S. Army, where they were often persecuted because of their religion, and chose to join the Mexican army, where they would not have to shoot fellow Catholics. They fought very bravely at Monterrey and several other major battles, in part because they knew if they were captured, they would be executed as deserters. Now, the Battle of Monterrey looked like a hard fight. A large citadel called the Black Fort by Americans protected the main road into the city. A river and several hills, most of them defended, protected the southern side of the city. However, while each of these defenses was strong in and of itself, they were spaced too far apart from the city and from each other to work together. It was possible to move around or between these defenses in some places without being in any field of fire from any one of them. Taylor sent General William Worth, who would later command a small fort in Texas still named after him, sent him around Monterrey to capture the hills behind the city. Worth did so and began attacking the city himself. Taylor sent the rest of his men to attack the city from the east end, bypassing the Black Fort. Soon the battle turned into house-by-house street fighting, much of it brutal hand-to-hand combat. And eventually the Mexican general, Pedro de Ampudia, agreed to negotiate, because while he still had a larger army, a lot of it was trapped in the city plaza. Taylor, though, agreed to let Ampudia and his men leave the city, march south with honor, not surrender and become prisoners. Because while Taylor might have been able to seize the city, it would have been very bloody, as he was still outnumbered, even if he did seem to have the advantage. Further, they agreed to a ceasefire to last for several months, infuriating both Polk and Santa Anna, each of whom thought that their generals should have pressed the advantage that they had. So, Santa Anna marched north to meet Taylor, but Taylor did not wait for him at Monterrey. He marched south with what was left of his army to defend a pass, a narrow pass through the hills south of the town of Buena Vista. He had about 4,800 men. Santa Anna arrived with 12,000, soon had 4,000 more to join them. There was a small skirmish, February 22nd, 1847, and the 23rd, Santa Anna attacked Taylor's line seriously. But Taylor was ready for him. The main road to Buena Vista had gullies on one side, a steep ridge on the other. Taylor placed his artillery up on that ridge to block the road, and along the road itself, and put most of his men on the large plateau above the road. Santa Anna's first attack was up the road to Buena Vista. The first wave of men was slaughtered by artillery on the road. On the main plateau, though, many new American recruits who had not seen combat before broke and ran, exposing the entire left flank of Taylor's army. One of his subordinates said, "General, we are whipped." But Taylor replied, "That is for me to determine." And as the line seemed ready to break, he sent his son-in-law, Jefferson Davis, a politician from Mississippi, to hold the line. And they did so. The Mississippi Rifles, first holding their fire to lure the Mexicans into a line. It was not a straight line, but kind of a V shape, as the Mississippians pulled their center back. Once the Mexicans got in the center of this V, Mississippi soldiers fired into them from both sides, then pulled out their Bowie knives for hand-to-hand combat. Jefferson Davis fighting with a Bowie knife in each hand. And by this point, although Taylor was still outnumbered, he was ready to charge. Santa Anna tried to prevent or at least delay this by sending an officer with an offer to negotiate peace terms, but Taylor recognized this as the trick it was, in part because the Mexicans kept shooting, even while claiming they wanted to negotiate peace, and Taylor ordered a charge. Although that charge did not succeed, when the Mexicans counterattacked, they were torn apart by American cannon fire. And American cannons playing a key role in a number of battles in the war, perhaps Buena Vista most of all. After this attack failed, Santa Anna pulled his men back into their camp. Taylor braced for another attack the next day, but instead Santa Anna retreated under cover of darkness back towards Mexico City, having given up northern Mexico for the moment, partly in fear that Mexico City might rise against him in his absence, and partly too because central Mexico itself was in danger. Now, when the war began, the commanding general of the U.S. Army was Winfield Scott, who held that post from 1841 to 1861, longer than any other officer. He was a military genius, but arrogant, inclined to say the wrong thing in public. His troops thought he was pompous. They called him Old Fuss and Feathers because he loved, fancy uniforms and all the rituals of military glamour. A young officer serving under him in Mexico, Ulysses S. Grant, said Winfield Scott wore the maximum uniform permitted by law. And I don't know what the legal limit of the uniform was, but I'm sure Winfield Scott knew it. Polk also distrusted Scott, and Taylor too, for that matter, because like many officers in the U.S. Army, they were Whigs. Polk too feared they might have political ambitions, and worried that allowing either of them to win too much military glory might propel one or the other to the presidency. Still, by October of 1846, Polk agreed to let Scott plan an attack on the east coast of Mexico. Scott, in fact, already had a plan to attack the great port city of Veracruz, founded by Cortez when he invaded Mexico in the early 1520s. And Scott was ready to land in March of 1847. He had 12,000 men. The Mexicans only had about 3,400 men, but it was a highly fortified city. The harbor of Veracruz was defended by a strong fortress on island. There were walls around the city. So Scott had his men land on the coast out of range of all those fortifications, and slowly began building earthworks, actually most of them of sand, around the city, taking 2 weeks to set up artillery, even though many of his officers wanted to make a direct assault. He planned to reduce the city by siege. And despite the difficulty of digging in the sand, eventually had the city surrounded, even borrowing huge, heavy guns from the Navy designed for bombarding fortress walls from the sea, and accepted the Navy's offer to fire on the city from the sea. The Army and Navy do not always work together well, especially in those days before the Department of Defense took charge of both. But but Scott worked quite well with the naval commanders in the Gulf of Mexico squadron. Scott gave the Mexican commander the chance to surrender on March 22nd, but he refused. Scott sent a warning to the many foreigners living in Veracruz, saying they ought to leave while they could. But that warning was ignored too. So that evening, Scott's batteries opened fire in a bombardment that lasted 3 days. And Scott, understanding the value of self-esteem, rotated the cannon crews, making sure that at least some men from every single unit in the Army, as well as men from the Navy, got to fire at least some cannons into the walls of Veracruz. And after 3 days, foreigners living in the city begged Winfield Scott to let them leave now, but he refused, saying they'd had their chance. And they helped convince General Morales, in command of Mexican forces there, to surrender, which was good for the United States, as Scott, by this point, was considering a frontal assault, despite the dangers of attacking the Great Walls of Veracruz, because he wanted to move inland as soon as possible to get away from the yellow fever, a variety of yellow fever known as el vomito negro, which was deadly along the coast in the spring of each year. He wanted to get away before it warmed up and the mosquitoes came out. Furthermore, of course, Santa Anna was marching south after his defeat at Buena Vista, although Santa Anna called it a victory. And so Scott marched inland toward Mexico City, following the same route taken by Hernan Cortez's conquistadors after leaving a small force to garrison Veracruz and keep it open for resupply from America. Santa Anna moved to block Scott's march at a place known as Cerro Gordo, or Fat Hill, also called El Telegrafio, because there was, or had once been, a semaphore station on top, an early form of telegraph that sent messages not by wire, but with a type of signal flag. And this was near the city of Jalapa. Scott had about 8,500 men, Santa Anna 10,000 or more, possibly as many as 18,000. Santa Anna set up batteries of cannons on the main road to Jalapa, hoping to repeat Taylor's tactics at Buena Vista, hoping that Scott would march up the road and be cut down by the cannons, because once again there was a ravine on one side of the road, steep hills on the other. It was believed that the only way to move through was up the road. But some of Scott's men, particularly two young engineers, Robert E. Lee and Pierre Beauregard, scouted a route through the hills beside the road, launching on the morning of April 18th a surprise attack up the back of Cerro Gordo, not just the back but the front too, hitting it from both sides, capturing the guns on top of the hill, and turning them on the Mexican forces on the road below. The Mexican army began to run. At first, Santa Anna sent reinforcements to Cerro Gordo, but as more and more men retreated, he himself ran away, having to abandon his own personal carriage, leaving behind food, cash money, and one of his artificial legs, one of his legs having been shot off several years ago by the French in what's known as the Pastry War. That leg is today in a museum in Springfield, Illinois, soldiers from Illinois having captured his carriage. This was a great victory for the U.S. Army, a great embarrassment for Santa Anna. He lost 1,000 men killed and wounded, 3,000 captured, compared to just 400 Americans killed or wounded. One problem Scott faced was what to do with all the cannons and muskets he captured, because he didn't have enough men to use them. So many of them were destroyed so the Mexicans wouldn't reclaim them later. Scott marched on to occupy the city of Jalapa, which many of his soldiers described as a very beautiful city, and then began marching toward Mexico City again. In Jalapa, and every place Scott captured, he made a point of treating the locals with the greatest possible respect, not seizing food or other supplies, but paying fair prices. punishing soldiers who mistreated the locals. He attended Catholic church services and encouraged his officers to do the same. He knew he had 10,000 men in the middle of 10 million Mexicans, could only survive by befriending the local population, many of whom did not trust or like Santa Anna. And for the most part, Scott succeeded in his policy, eventually cutting off his supply lines to the coast because he couldn't spare the men to occupy every town and village on the road. And he was able to trust that the Mexicans would not cut him off, but would allow his supplies to travel down the road to reach him. Some Mexicans even worked as scouts for Scott's army. And more supplies and reinforcements did come. In August of 1847, after receiving reinforcements, Scott's army descended into the Valley of Mexico. By now he had a little over 10,000 men ready to fight, while Santa Anna had about 35,000 men ready to defend Mexico City. And late August and early September, Scott's army won several victories south of Mexico City, including one in which future President Franklin Pierce took part, being famous in the battle for falling off his horse, either due to cannon fire frightening the horse, which stumbled on rough ground, or possibly, according to Whigs, because Pierce was drunk. The most famous of the battles outside Mexico City was at Chapultepec, a castle guarding two of the main roads into the southwestern end of Mexico City. It also served as the Mexican Military Academy. But although it was an important fortification, it was lightly defended, with fewer than 1,000 men, a number of them cadets at the Military Academy. At first, Scott's men bombarded the fortress with artillery on September 12, 1847. On the 13th, American soldiers attacked, eventually raising so many scaling ladders that 50 men could climb the castle walls at a time. The Mexican commander ordered a retreat, but 6 cadets of the Military Academy refused to go, and 5 were killed by American soldiers, until the very last one wrapped himself in the flag and jumped off the walls, Juan Escutia falling to his death to defend his country's flag. These cadets are now known as the Boy Heroes, and there's a monument to them at Chapultepec in Mexico City. Among the American forces at Chapultepec were men from the U.S. Marine Corps, who remember the battle by another poetic name for Chapultepec, which was near the home of the ancient Aztec emperors. They referred to it as the Halls of Montezuma, which appears, of course, in the opening line of the Marine Corps' hymn. And as the American flag was raised over Chapultepec, 30 men watching the flag raised were hanged. Scott had ordered that a group of San Patricios captured at the recent Battle of Churubusco be hanged when they were able to see the American flag flying over Chapultepec. After capturing Chapultepec, the U.S. Army broke into Mexico City, blasting their way through the gates on the southwestern corner of the city, and spent the rest of September 13th taking possession of the strong points in Mexico City. 8 a.m. on September 14th, 1847, Winfield Scott rode in triumph into the center of Mexico City in his best dress uniform. September 15th, Santa Anna resigned as president of Mexico, but continued to lead part of the army for a time, although soon his soldiers refused to follow him. In 1851, he went into exile in Jamaica, although later returned for another term as president of Mexico, being forced out for the last time in 1854. And Taylor and Scott were not the only conquerors of Mexico. Even before Taylor moved across the Rio Nueces, Army Captain John C. Frémont had led about 60 armed men into California and slowly marched toward Oregon. When rumors of war reached California, some of the 1,000 American settlers in Sonoma declared their independence from Mexico as the Bear Flag Republic on June 14, 1846. Local Mexican officials agreed that American annexation was inevitable and did nothing to stop the revolt. Frémont soon arrived, and declared the Republic of California to be annexed by the United States July 9, 1846. And while there were a few small skirmishes, Frémont, with the help of local Americans, and for that matter some Mexicans who wanted their independence from the incompetent leadership of Santa Anna, and the U.S. Navy who appeared off the coast, California was firmly under American control by 1847. And Stephen Kearny had done the same thing in New Mexico. As soon as war broke out, he had marched along the Santa Fe Trail to the capital of New Mexico with 1,700 men. He captured the town with no fighting, declared it to be part of the United States on August 15, 1846, and 3 days later was officially named military governor. He offered American citizenship to any Mexican citizen who asked for it, an offer not open to American Indians living in that territory, which some of them resented. The next month, he marched into California, where he replaced Frémont as the military governor there. And while Scott had been on his way to Mexico City, he'd been joined by an American diplomat, Nicholas Trist, whom at first he had distrusted and even disliked, but the two came to be close friends. And following Scott's capture of Mexico City, Trist negotiated the Treaty of Guadeloupe Hidalgo, which the Mexican government signed March 2, 1848. Official ratifications were exchanged on May 30th of that year. And in this treaty, the United States agreed to pay Mexico $15 million in cash and assume $3.25 million in Mexican debts owed to American citizens. In exchange for that, Mexico ceded over half the territory it had claimed prior to the war. It not only recognized the American annexation of Texas with its border at the Rio Grande, but also ceded Upper California and New Mexico, or most of it, to the United States. Perhaps they should have taken the $25 million Slidell had tried to offer them 3 years before. Although treaties, while negotiated by the president or his diplomats, must be negotiated or passed by the Senate, and it was barely passed, as a number of conscience Whigs who had thought the war was unjust and felt it was just a cover for the expansion of slavery, opposed ratifying the treaty. There were also some expansionists who thought America should have tried to keep all of Mexico and felt Trist had not gotten enough. Although there were others who only wanted the less populous parts of Mexico, not wanting to absorb 10 million fairly brown and very Catholic people into the United States. There were others who would question the war too. In 1846, the transcendentalist writer Henry David Thoreau refused to pay 6 years of unpaid poll taxes because at that point they would have been used, he felt, to pay for the war. He was imprisoned for a night until someone, possibly a friend, possibly a relative who was embarrassed, paid the taxes for him, and he got out of prison. He said he didn't like that, but he left prison anyway. He later published Resistance to Civil Government, later republished under the title Civil Disobedience, arguing that it was the duty of a citizen to disobey an unjust law or a corrupt government. And he felt the U.S. government was corrupt in this case, fighting a war, as he saw it, to expand slavery. And in 1846, and again in 1847, another conscience Whig, David Wilmot, a congressman by that name, proposed the Wilmot Proviso, an amendment to a bill approving funding for the Army, which would have banned slavery in any territories won from Mexico during the war. The House passed this proviso both times, the North, counting the West as part of the North, outnumbering the South in terms of population quite a bit, but the Senate rejected it both times, North and South being balanced in the Senate. However, the war would lead to a new outbreak of debates over the expansion over slavery, as the Missouri Compromise began to fall apart. And many Americans worried about the results of the war. Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "Mexico will poison us." John C. Calhoun said, "Mexico is to us the forbidden fruit. The penalty of eating it would be to subject our institutions to political death." Although his primary fear was if the U.S. were to annex all of Mexico, the only way to govern so large and different an area and population would be essentially by becoming a tyrannical empire and losing our democracy. The war had a powerful legacy. Of course, it added, at the time, a third of America's territory, about a fourth of modern American territory, Alaska later balancing much of it out. Furthermore, it provided the first test of the graduates of the relatively new military academy at West Point, giving them military experience, which many of them will later use as they fight on both sides in the Civil War. And the same year that California was officially added to the United States, gold was discovered near Sacramento, sparking the California Gold Rush. And having acquired Texas, California, New Mexico, and settled the Oregon boundary dispute, having lowered the tariff and established an independent treasury, James K. Polk fulfilled his promise to only serve one term. He had not run for re-election, and exhausted by his hard-working schedule, he contracted cholera on a post-presidential tour of the South, went home, and died in Nashville 3 months after leaving office. And Polk, as he had feared, was followed as president by old rough and ready Zachary Taylor, a Southern Whig.